The courthouse clerk's hands shook as he counted the coins. $1 silver. That was all. For a house worth 200 times that amount, maybe more. Thomas Brennan folded the deed into his coat pocket, still unable to believe what had just happened. The seller hadn't even negotiated. Just grabbed the dollar, signed the papers, and vanished into the crowd outside the territorial courthouse, like smoke. Something wrong with that property? Thomas had asked the clerk. The old man had shrugged, avoiding eye contact. Previous owner was in a powerful hurry to sell. That's all I know. Now Thomas stood before the small wooden house at the end of a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. The structure was modest, but solid, with a covered porch and windows that caught the late afternoon light. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. A child's wooden toy horse lay forgotten in the dusty yard. His chest tightened. Someone was living here. The front door stood slightly ajar. Thomas pushed it open slowly, his boots creaking against the threshold. The interior was clean, lived in. A woman's shawl hung from a wooden peg. Fresh cornbread cooled on a rough-hewn table. Wildflowers in a mason jar brightened the windowsill. "Hello," he called softly. From behind him came the sound of small bare feet on wooden floorboards. "Are you my new papa?" Thomas turned to find a little girl standing in the doorway, no more than 7 years old. Her auburn hair was braided with blue ribbon, her calico dress patched but clean. She clutched a cornhusk doll against her chest and looked at him with eyes that held far too much hope for someone so young. The words stuck in Thomas's throat. "I just bought this house, little one. Where's your mama?" The girl's lower lip trembled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft from handling. "She left this for my new papa. That's you, isn't it?" Thomas took the letter with unsteady hands. As he unfolded it, he realized the dollar house had come with something he hadn't bargained for, something that would change everything he thought he knew about starting over. The letter was written in careful script on paper that had been folded and refolded many times. To whoever reads this, it began. "My name is Catherine Mills. If you are holding this letter, you have bought our home for $1, and you have met my daughter Lucy. I know what you must think, but please understand before you judge me." Thomas glanced at the little girl. Lucy. She had settled into a chair at the kitchen table, swinging her legs, still watching him with that devastating trust. Her small hands rested folded in her lap like she'd been taught proper manners by someone who cared. "I have consumption," the letter continued. "The doctor in town says I have perhaps a month, maybe 2, if I'm fortunate. There is no money for medicine, no family to take Lucy when I'm gone. The bank was going to foreclose anyway. At least this way she has shelter. Maybe she has someone who will see her worth." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He looked around the modest home with new understanding. The child's careful behavior wasn't natural quietness. It was learned caution. The fresh bread wasn't abundance. It was probably made from the last of their flour. "I am not abandoning her," the letter continued. "I am giving her the only chance I have left to give. You bought a house for $1 because you needed something too. Perhaps you needed her as much as she needs you." Thomas knelt beside Lucy's chair. She looked at him with solemn eyes that had seen too much sorrow for someone her age. "Your mama," he said gently. "She's not coming back today, is she?" Lucy shook her head. "She said my new papa would take care of me now. She said she had to go where the sickness couldn't follow, but you'd be here." Her voice was steady, matter of fact. "You are staying, aren't you?" Before Thomas could answer, the thunder of approaching horses made them both turn toward the window. 4 riders were coming up the dusty path, their faces hard beneath wide-brimmed hats. Something about their purposeful approach made Thomas's blood run cold. He moved instinctively between Lucy and the door, his hand reaching for the rifle he'd left leaning against the wall. Through the window, he could see them clearly now. Men who made their living from other people's misfortune. "Go hide in the back room," he whispered to Lucy. "Don't come out until I tell you. The little girl's eyes went wide, but she obeyed without question, disappearing into the bedroom with practiced silence. Her instant compliance told Thomas this wasn't the first time she'd been told to hide from dangerous strangers. The knock came hard and demanding against the doorframe. Thomas opened the door just wide enough to show his face, keeping his rifle visible, but not threatening. "Help you, gentlemen." The leader was a bull of a man with tobacco-stained teeth and eyes like chips of flint. "Looking for Catherine Mills. Heard she lives here." "House belongs to me now," Thomas said carefully. "Bought it this morning. Legal and proper." The man's eyes narrowed. "That's so well that woman owes our employer considerable money. Debt doesn't just disappear because she sold her house." He pushed past Thomas into the home, his three companions following. They moved with the confidence of men accustomed to taking what they wanted without permission. "I told you she's not here." "Maybe not," the man said, walking through the small rooms with predatory casualness. "But her belongings sure are. Her child's too, I'd wager." He stopped beside Lucy's corn-husk doll, which she'd dropped in her haste to hide. He picked it up, examining it with mock interest. Cute little thing. Would be a shame if something happened to her because Mama decided to run off without paying what she owes. The threat hung in the air, like gun smoke. Thomas felt his jaw clench. "There's no child here." The man laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. "Is that so? Then you won't mind if we take a look around?" His companions started toward the bedroom where Lucy was hiding. Thomas raised his rifle, the barrel trained steady on the leader's chest. "I said there's no child here." For a moment the only sound was breathing. Then the leader smiled again. "You know, mister, I think you might be lying to us. We don't take kindly to liars." But before his men could move toward the bedroom, new sounds reached them from outside. More horses approaching fast, and from the thunder of hooves on hard earth, whoever was coming meant business. The riders burst into the clearing like a storm front. 6 men on lathered horses led by someone wearing a marshal's badge that caught the dying light. But something about the marshal's grim expression told Thomas this wasn't a routine visit. Byron, the leader, called to his men, lowering his own weapon, but not holstering it. "Looks like we got company." Marshal Garrett dismounted his hand, resting casually on his gun belt. His weathered face took in the scene with practiced eyes. Thomas with his rifle, the 4 men who'd been searching his house, the tension thick as morning fog. "Afternoon, Wade," Marshal Garrett said to the leader. "Heard there might be some trouble brewing at the old Mills place." Wade forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "No trouble here, Marshal. Just a business matter with the former owner." "Former owner," says Garrett, looked at Thomas with interest. "That would be you, I take it." Thomas nodded slowly, not lowering his rifle. "Bought the place this morning. Legal and proper. For $1, Wade added, with a sneer. "Mighty suspicious, don't you think? Marshal woman disappears right when she owes money, sells her house for practically nothing. Makes a man wonder what else she might have been selling." The implication was clear and sickening. Marshal Garrett's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Wade. Hope you have evidence to back it up." "Well, no, but then I suggest you keep your theories to yourself." Garrett stepped closer to the house. "Mind if I take a look at that deed?" Thomas hesitated, then pulled the document from his pocket. The marshal examined it carefully, his weathered face revealing nothing. Behind them, Wade and his men waited with growing unease. "Looks legitimate," Garrett finally said, handing it back. "Signed, witnessed, properly recorded." He studied Thomas's face. "Course that doesn't explain why Catherine Mills would sell for such a low price." Before Thomas could answer, a small sound came from the back room, the soft creak of a floorboard. Everyone heard it. Wade's eyes lit up with triumph. "There's our proof, Marshal." Marshal Garrett held up a hand. "Stay where you are, Wade." He looked at Thomas with eyes that had seen too much of human nature. "Son, I'm going to ask you straight, and I want a straight answer. Is there a child in this house?" Thomas met his gaze steadily. There was no point in lying now. "Yes," Wade let out a harsh laugh. "There's our evidence. Catherine Mills sold more than just a house." "Shut your mouth, Wade. before I shut it for you. The marshal's hand moved closer to his gun. You're talking about a child. He turned back to Thomas. What's the situation here? Thomas made a choice that would change everything. Her mother left her when she sold the house, left a letter saying she couldn't care for her anymore. Convenient story, Wade muttered. Marshal Garrett ignored him. Where's this letter? Thomas produced it from his pocket. The marshal read it through twice, his expression growing more troubled with each line. When he finished, he looked at Thomas with something that might have been respect. Takes a certain kind of man to tell the truth when a lie would serve him better. He folded the letter carefully. Under territorial law, this child needs to be placed with proper authorities until her mother can be located. No. The word came out harder than Thomas intended. She stays with me. That's not how the law works, son. Then the law's wrong. Thomas's voice carried a conviction that surprised even him. You take her to town, you know what happens. She disappears into some institution where nobody cares if she lives or dies. At least here she's got someone who'll fight for her. Wade stepped forward. What about the money her mother owes, $300 plus interest? That debt doesn't just disappear. The child isn't responsible for her mother's debts, Marshal Garrett said firmly. Maybe not legally, Wade replied with a cold smile. But there are other ways to collect. My boss isn't particular about methods. The threat hung in the air, like smoke. Thomas felt his grip tighten on his rifle, but Marshal Garrett was already moving his hand, dropping to his gun. That sounded very much like a threat against a child, Wade, in front of a lawman no less. Just stating facts, Marshal. Business is business. Not when it involves children, it isn't. Garrett's voice was deadly quiet. I think you and your boys better ride out now, before this conversation takes a turn you won't like. But as Wade and his men backed toward their horses, another rider appeared at the edge of the clearing. This one was different, well-dressed, riding an expensive horse, with the bearing of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. And from the way Wade's face went pale at the sight of him, Thomas knew their troubles had just gotten much worse. The well-dressed man dismounted with the deliberate grace of someone who owned everything he surveyed. His clothes were tailored, his boots polished mirror-bright. When he smiled, it was the expression of a snake considering its next meal. Marshal Garrett, he said, touching the brim of his hat with mock courtesy. What brings the territorial law out to my little business transaction? Your business transaction, Blackwood Marshal Garrett, studied the newcomer with unconcealed distaste. Didn't realize you were in the habit of threatening children. So this was Blackwood, the boss Wade had mentioned. Thomas sized him up, quickly recognizing danger in a different form than Wade's brute force. This man wielded power like a surgeon's blade, precise and cutting, threatening children. Blackwood looked genuinely puzzled, though Thomas caught the calculating gleam behind his eyes. Marshal, I'm simply trying to collect a legitimate debt. Catherine Mills borrowed money from my lending operation 6 months ago. At what interest rate? Garrett asked sharply. Standard rates for high-risk borrowers. Blackwood's smile was razor-thin. 35% monthly compounded. Thomas felt his stomach drop. At that rate, a $300 debt would have grown to over 1,000 by now. No wonder Catherine had felt desperate enough to abandon her daughter. That's legal robbery, Garrett said flatly. It's legal business, Marshal. Filed with the territorial government, all proper and above board. Blackwood turned his attention to Thomas for the first time. You must be the new property owner. Interesting transaction, $1 for a house and land, worth easily 300 times that amount. The deed is legal, Thomas said carefully. Oh, I'm sure it is. But debts can transfer with property ownership under certain circumstances, especially when there's evidence of fraud or conspiracy to avoid payment. Blackwood produced a leather portfolio and extracted an official-looking document. I've had my attorney prepare a claim of fraudulent transfer. Unless the debt is satisfied, I can force the sale of this property. Marshal Garrett stepped forward. Let me see that. As the marshal read, his expression grew darker. Thomas felt ice form in his veins as he realized Blackwood's game. The man hadn't come here just to collect from Catherine. He'd come to take everything, the house, the land, and possibly Lucy, as collateral. This is, Garrett paused, clearly struggling with what he was reading. This might actually hold up in territorial court. I thought it might, Blackwood said smoothly. Of course there are alternatives to foreclosure. The debt could be satisfied through other arrangements, labor contracts, for instance. The implication chilled Thomas's blood. Blackwood wanted Lucy as an indentured servant working off her mother's impossible debt for years to come. Over my dead body, Thomas said quietly. Blackwood's smile widened. That can certainly be arranged, Mr. Brennan. But I prefer business solutions to violent ones, much less messy. He knew Thomas's name. He'd come prepared for this exact confrontation, which meant whatever game Blackwood was playing, he was several moves ahead of everyone else. You know, Blackwood continued studying Thomas with the intensity of a man who made his living reading weaknesses. I did some research on you before coming out here. Thomas Brennan, former Army scout, lost your wife and 2 sons to cholera 3 years ago. Been drifting ever since, looking for something to fill that emptiness. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice water. There were wounds in his past he'd hoped to leave buried pain that had driven him to seek out this remote corner of nowhere. Tragic story. Blackwood continued with false sympathy. A man carrying that kind of guilt might do anything to save a child, even something foolish like buying into an obvious setup. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. You orchestrated this, Thomas whispered. You knew Catherine was desperate, knew she'd try something like this, and you knew I'd be vulnerable to it. Blackwood shrugged. I understand human nature, Mr. Brennan. Grief makes people predictable. A man who failed to save his own family might go to extraordinary lengths to save someone else's. Everything, the dollar sale, finding Lucy alone, the timing of Blackwood's arrival, had been planned. But that didn't change the fundamental truth. There was still a little girl, depending on him. What do you want? Thomas asked. Simple. Sign over the property deed to me, and I'll consider Catherine's debt satisfied. The child can go to the territorial orphanage where she belongs, and you can continue your wandering with a clear conscience. And if I refuse, Blackwood's expression turned predatory. Then I file my fraud claim, force the sale anyway, and pursue Catherine Mills for the remaining debt. When I find her, and I will find her, she'll work in my establishments until every penny is paid. That'll take, 15 to 20 years, I'd estimate. From the bedroom came a small sound, Lucy clearing her throat. She'd been listening to strangers discuss her fate like she was livestock, and she hadn't made a sound until now. In that moment, Thomas realized she was braver than any of the adults in the room. I need time to think, Thomas said. Of course. Blackwood consulted a gold pocket watch. You have until tomorrow at noon. Then I file the papers and take possession. He turned to go, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Brennan, don't think about running. I have men watching every road out of the territory. As Blackwood and his men rode away, silence settled over the small house like dust after a windstorm. But from the bedroom, Thomas heard something that changed everything. Lucy was singing softly to her corn-husk doll, a lullaby her mother must have taught her. The sound of innocent trust in the face of adult cruelty broke something open in Thomas's chest that had been frozen for 3 years. That evening, after Marshal Garrett reluctantly departed with promises to research Blackwood's legal claims, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, staring at the fraudulent transfer document. The words blurred together as exhaustion and despair warred in his mind. Lucy emerged from the bedroom, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She'd changed into a white nightgown that made her look even smaller and more fragile. Without a word, she climbed onto the chair across from him and placed something on the table, a small wooden box he hadn't noticed before. Mama told me to give this to my new papa, she said solemnly. But only if the really bad man came, the one with the fancy clothes and mean eyes. Thomas opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside, wrapped in faded blue cloth, were documents, but not what he'd expected. These were letters, contracts, and what appeared to be sworn statements from other families. As he read by lamplight, his eyes widened. Catherine Mills hadn't been as helpless as she'd appeared. She'd been gathering evidence against Blackwood for months, documenting his illegal lending practices and fraudulent foreclosures. "Mama said grown-ups who hurt children always get too confident," Lucy said in her clear, serious voice. "They make mistakes because they think little people don't matter, but little people see everything." One letter was from a banker in the territorial capital, warning that Blackwood's interest rates exceeded legal limits. Another was from a family in the next county, describing how they'd lost their farm to the same fraudulent transfer scheme. A third documented Blackwood's connection to several establishments that exploited desperate women and children. Thomas looked at Lucy with new understanding. "Your mama wasn't running away, was she? She was setting a trap." Lucy nodded solemnly. "She said sometimes you have to look helpless to catch the wolf, but she was scared the sickness would take her before the trap could work." "Where is she now, Lucy?" "In town, staying with the doctor's wife. The medicine is helping, but she had to pretend to be gone, so the bad man would show his true face." Lucy's small hand touched Thomas's arm. "She said if you turned out to be good, really good, then maybe we could all be a family. All three of us." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching horses shattered the night's quiet. But this time, only 2 riders approached, and one of them was a woman. Catherine Mills was thinner than Thomas had expected her face, pale from illness, but her eyes blazing with fierce maternal determination. She dismounted carefully, favored her left side, where the consumption had weakened her, but her voice was strong. "Mr. Brennan," she said, stepping onto the porch, "I owe you an apology for the deception, but I needed someone Blackwood couldn't buy or intimidate. Someone with nothing left to lose who might choose to protect a child over protecting himself." The second rider was Marshall Garrett, his face grim in the lamplight. "She came to me tonight with evidence that changes everything. Blackwood's operation is illegal from top to bottom." "Then why isn't he in jail?" Thomas asked. "Because we need to catch him in the act," Catherine said. "The territorial judge requires ironclad proof for men with Blackwood's connections. We have the evidence, but we need him to confess to the fraud publicly." "How do we do that?" Catherine smiled grimly. "By giving him exactly what he thinks he wants. Tomorrow at noon, you're going to sign over the deed, but not to Blackwood, to the territorial government, with a clause that voids the transfer if any coercion was involved. He'll never fall for that. He will if he thinks he's won. Men like Blackwood can't resist gloating over their victories." She looked at her daughter through the window, where Lucy had fallen asleep in her chair. "But if this goes wrong, if something happens to me, will you really take care of her?" Thomas followed her gaze to the sleeping child. Lucy had trusted him instantly, completely, with the kind of faith that demanded everything in return. "Yes," he said simply, "I will." But as they made their final preparations for tomorrow's confrontation, none of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from the barn and melted back into the darkness. Blackwood hadn't trusted them to stay put, and now he knew exactly what they were planning. Noon came with storm clouds building on the horizon, and a wind that carried the scent of rain and trouble. Thomas stood on the porch of the house he'd owned for less than 2 days, watching Blackwood's approaching entourage with grim determination. But something was wrong. Instead of the small group from yesterday, Blackwood had brought 12 men. His confidence was too complete, his smile too satisfied. Somehow he'd learned about their plan. Catherine emerged from the house where she'd been hiding her face, pale but resolute. Lucy stayed inside as instructed, but Thomas could see her small face pressed to the window, watching everything with those solemn, too wise eyes. "Mrs. Mills," Blackwood called out cheerfully as he dismounted. "How delightful that you could join us. This saves me the trouble of tracking you down later." Marshall Garrett stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Blackwood, I have some questions about your business practices. I'm sure you do, Marshal. But first, let's conclude our transaction. Blackwood's eyes glittered with malicious triumph. You see, I had my men watching the house last night. Interesting conversation you all had about evidence and traps and territorial judges. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Their entire plan had been compromised. Oh, yes, Blackwood continued. I know all about Mrs. Mills's little collection of documents, touching really how she thought she could outsmart a man of my resources. He gestured, and two of his men produced a bound figure, the banker who'd written the letter documenting Blackwood's illegal interest rates. Mr. Henderson here has agreed to recant his accusations, Blackwood said pleasantly. Haven't you, Henderson? The banker's face was bruised, his clothes torn. He nodded frantically, clearly terrified. And the other families whose statements you collected, Mrs. Mills. They've also had changes of heart. Amazing how quickly people remember things differently when properly motivated. Catherine's face went white. Without the corroborating testimony, her evidence wouldn't hold up in court. So you see, Blackwood continued, your little trap has collapsed rather completely. Now, Mr. Brennan, about that deed transfer. The transfer goes to the territorial government, Thomas said, trying to salvage something from their ruined plan. With protective clauses. Blackwood laughed. Oh, I don't think so. You see, I've prepared a different document. He produced an official-looking paper. This transfers the property directly to me, along with custody of the child as collateral for her mother's debt. Sign it, or my men will simply take what I want anyway. Marshal Garrett stepped forward. I won't let you. You'll do nothing, Marshal Blackwood interrupted. Because your lovely wife is currently visiting my associates in town. Such a charming woman. Be a shame if something happened to her because you interfered in legal business matters. The trap was perfect. Thomas could sign away everything and still not save Lucy from years of exploitation, or he could refuse and watch innocent people suffer for his defiance. From inside the house came a sound that changed everything. Lucy, singing that same lullaby she'd sung the night before. But this time, other voices joined in. Children's voices coming from the woods around the clearing. Blackwood spun around, confusion replacing his confident smile. What is that? From the tree line emerged figures Thomas hadn't expected, families, dozens of them, led by children of all ages. They carried handwritten signs and sang Lucy's lullaby, with voices that carried across the clearing like a prayer made audible. An older woman stepped forward, her gray hair braided with dignity, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. Mr. Blackwood, she said in a voice that could have cut steel. I'm Sarah Henderson, the banker's wife. Did you really think threatening one family would silence an entire community? Behind her came more families, farmers, shopkeepers, even the town minister. All of them carrying copies of documents, all of them ready to testify about Blackwood's crimes. You made one mistake, Sarah continued. You assumed that people who've lost everything have nothing left to fight with. But we have each other. And we have the truth. Catherine stepped forward, her voice stronger now. Every family you've destroyed kept records. Every victim you silenced found others to speak for them. You can threaten one witness, Mr. Blackwood, but you can't threaten an entire territory. Blackwood's face had gone white with fury. This is meaningless. Children's songs and rural rabble won't hold up in court, but territorial law will. Said a new voice from the road. A distinguished man in a black coat rode into the clearing, flanked by federal marshals. The territorial judge himself, drawn by reports of systematic fraud and corruption. Judge Morrison, Marshal Garrett said with relief. Thank God you came. Hard to ignore when half the territory sends telegrams about the same criminal operation, the judge replied dryly. He looked at Blackwood with distaste. Mr. Blackwood, you're under arrest for fraud, illegal lending practices, and conspiracy to exploit minors. Blackwood's men began backing away, unwilling to face federal law enforcement. But Blackwood himself wasn't finished. You think you've won, he snarled, pulling a hidden gun from his coat. I'll burn this whole place down, before I let you destroy everything I've built." He aimed the weapon not at Thomas or the marshal, but at the window where Lucy's small face was still visible. In that moment, Thomas understood that Blackwood's madness ran deeper than greed. He would rather destroy an innocent child than accept defeat. Thomas moved without thinking, throwing himself between the gun and the window just as Blackwood fired. The gunshot echoed across the clearing like thunder, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. Thomas felt the bullet's impact, a burning line across his shoulder that spun him around and sent him crashing into the porch railing. But he was alive, and through the window he could see Lucy was unharmed. Her small hands pressed to the glass in terror, but her body protected by his sacrifice. Marshal Garrett's return shot was swift and sure. Blackwood crumpled to the dusty earth, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. Around the clearing, his remaining men surrendered without resistance, their loyalty extending only as far as their pay. Catherine rushed to Thomas's side, her practiced hands quickly assessing his wound. "It's not serious," she said with relief. "The bullet just grazed you." "Thank God," Thomas breathed, then looked up at her with sudden clarity. "Catherine, I need to tell you something. I didn't just buy this house by accident. I've been looking for a reason to stop running from my past, and Lucy gave me that reason. You both did." Lucy burst through the front door and threw her small arms around Thomas's neck, careful of his wounded shoulder. "You saved me," she whispered. "You really are my papa now." Judge Morrison approached, stepping over Blackwood's still form. "Mr. Brennan, your actions today show remarkable character. Mrs. Mills, the evidence you gathered will help us prosecute this entire criminal network." He paused, studying the small family group with judicial insight. "There's still the matter of the child's legal status." Thomas and Catherine looked at each other, understanding passing between them without words. "Your Honor," Thomas said carefully, "if Mrs. Mills would agree, I'd like to formally adopt Lucy. And if Catherine would have me, I'd like to ask her to be my wife." Lucy clapped her hands together. "Really, we can be a real family." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. "Thomas, I'm still sick. The consumption can be treated," interrupted Dr. Williams, who had arrived with the territorial officials. "With proper medicine and care, many people recover completely. I've seen it before." "Then yes," Catherine whispered. "Yes to all of it." 6 months later, the small wooden house that Thomas had bought for $1 had been expanded with new rooms and a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. A garden bloomed in the former dusty yard, tended by Catherine, whose health had improved dramatically with proper treatment and the healing power of hope realized. Lucy, now legally Lucy Brennan, had grown 2 inches and gained the healthy roundness of a well-fed, well-loved child. She helped her mother in the garden and followed Thomas around the property as he made improvements, chattering constantly about everything she saw and learned. "Papa," she said one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset, "do you ever think about the $1 you spent to buy our house?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "Every day, little one. Best $1 I ever spent. Mama says it wasn't really about the money. She says you bought us with your heart, not your wallet." Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face healthy and radiant in the golden light. "What are my 2 favorite people talking about?" "Papa's $1, Lucy announced. Catherine settled beside Thomas on the porch swing he'd built, taking his hand in hers. "That $1 changed 3 lives, she said softly. "Yours, mine, and Lucy's." "It saved 3 lives, Thomas corrected. "I was just as lost as you were, just in a different way." Lucy curled up between them, her head resting on Thomas's uninjured shoulder. "So we all saved each other." "That's exactly right," Thomas said, wrapping his arms around both his girls as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. In the distance, other families were lighting their lamps and settling in for the evening families that were safe now, because one man had been willing to pay everything he had for the chance to protect one small girl. The dollar house had become a home, and 3 broken people had become something neither money nor law could create: a family forged in courage and sealed with love. The deed to the house still hung framed on the kitchen wall, a reminder not of what it had cost, but of what it had given them. Sometimes, the most valuable things in life came with the smallest price tags, but demanded the greatest courage to claim. As Thomas held his wife and daughter close, he realized he had indeed gotten exactly what he'd paid for. He'd bought a house for $1 and found a fortune beyond measure, the kind that lived not in banks or deeds, but in the daily miracle of people who chose to love each other, despite everything the world could throw against them.